I have spent most of my life thinking about value, not excitement. That sounds simple, but it is one of the hardest disciplines in the world to keep when the crowd is making noise, when television is speaking in certainties, and when governments are telling people that the rules they lived under yesterday will still protect them tomorrow. Most people do not lose money because they are stupid. They lose money because they mistake familiarity for safety. They assume that if they have been paid in the same currency for years, if their savings account still shows a number on the screen, if their pension statement still arrives on time, then the structure underneath all of it must still be sound. That assumption has ruined generations. What destroys wealth in the great transitions of history is rarely one dramatic day. It is usually a long period when people keep measuring their lives with a ruler that has already started shrinking. That is the danger I want to talk about. I am not interested in sensationalism. I am not interested in panic. Panic is expensive. It makes people trade badly, borrow badly, and seek comfort from the very institutions that are losing control of the process. What interests me is mechanism. When you understand mechanism, you stop reacting to headlines and start seeing the plumbing underneath the house. And the plumbing under the global financial house is telling us something plain. The world is carrying more debt than at any point in its modern history. The source document puts global debt above $315 trillion, and it treats that number the way it should be treated, not as trivia, but as a signal that the financial system is no longer being asked to support commerce alone. It is being asked to carry promises on top of promises, leverage on top of leverage, and political convenience on top of economic reality. Faithfully cite Fay-Turn 29, File 0 Fay that matters because debt, in moderation, can be a useful servant. In excess, it becomes a claim on the future that grows faster than the future itself. The United States, according to the same document, is now carrying national debt above $34 trillion, while annual interest expense has grown so large that it competes with the biggest line items in government. That is not the kind of development a disciplined system shrugs off forever. Fay-Turn 29, File 0 Fay, a nation can live with a great many imbalances for a long time when it issues the currency the world trusts most. That is the privilege. The trap is that privilege teaches bad habits. When other nations need your currency for trade, for savings, for settlement, for reserves, you can finance deficits more easily than anyone else. You can postpone pain, you can export some of your inflation, you can pay more for mistakes before those mistakes arrive at your own front door over time. That comfort changes character. What started as strength turns into exemption. What started as flexibility turns into indiscipline. What started as trust turns into assumption. I have seen that pattern in companies. I have seen it in management teams. I have seen it in industries that believed they had a permanent moat when what they really had was a temporary head start. The same thing happens to nations. A dominant financial order is usually born honestly enough. It rises because one country or empire is more productive, more organized, more innovative, more militarily secure, or more trusted than the rest. It sets the standard because others would rather operate inside its rules than outside them. At the beginning, this works wonderfully. Trade expands, credit becomes easier, standards of living rise, the dominant power looks efficient, disciplined, and almost inevitable. Then something subtle happens. Success begins to finance behavior that discipline never would have approved. Borrowing expands, money expands, obligations expand, wars become easier to fund, social promises become easier to make. The dominant power starts spending not just from earned strength, but from assumed permanence. That is when the character of the system changes. The source document lays this out as a repeating four-stage cycle. I think the language is blunt, but the underlying intuition is sound. First, there is establishment, then expansion and debasement, then overextension and loss of control, then the transfer into a new order. The names can vary, the speed can vary, the costume changes with each century, the mechanism remains remarkably familiar. Fay-Turn 29, File 0 Fay people resist that conclusion because they want history to be a museum. History is not a museum. History is an instruction manual that most people refuse to read until their own chapter starts. Take Rome at its height. Rome looked indestructible. It had reach, military credibility, tax power, administrative capacity, and a currency trusted across a vast trading network. The document points to the denarius and to the gradual reduction in silver content over time, from a highly trusted coin to something so debased that the public was left holding a shell of what had once been money. That did not happen in one theatrical collapse. It happened through repeated compromises, repeated fiscal needs, repeated decisions to protect appearance rather than substance. Fay file cite Fay turn 29 file 0 Fay. That is what people miss. Collapse is usually preceded by a long career of rationalization, a little clipping here, a little issuance there, a little emergency finance, a little more state need, a little more confidence that the public will absorb it. By the time the public recognizes the pattern has already been feeding on them for years. The wealthy who survive those periods rarely survive by holding the paper promise of the old order. They survive by holding something outside it. Land, production, food, metal, assets connected to life rather than to decree. Then there is the Dutch example, which I consider especially useful because it happened in a more modern financial setting. The Dutch Republic built a magnificent machine, finance, trade, markets, innovation, shipping, and institutional sophistication gave it a position far larger than its physical size would suggest. That is often how leadership looks. Leadership does not always belong to the largest body. Sometimes it belongs to the best organized brain. But brilliance carries its own temptation. The Dutch system expanded, borrowed, defended trade routes, and assumed that being the financial center of the world meant the world would keep financing Dutch dominance on Dutch terms. That assumption never lasts forever. The document points to the wars, the debt loads, and the migration of financial centrality from Amsterdam to London. That is the point I want you to notice. Wealth did not vanish, it moved. The old center became less central. The new center became the place where claims were priced, capital was raised, and the future was financed. Fay file cite Fay turn 29, file 0 Fay. That is how great financial transfers work. The world does not stop valuing money. It changes what it trusts. Britain offers the clearest bridge to the present. The pound once sat where the dollar sits today. London once performed the role New York performs today. Trade finance, sovereign credit, commodity pricing, and cross-border capital all pass through that system. For a long time, that arrangement looked natural, almost moral. People confuse what has existed for a long time with what deserves to exist forever. Then the bill arrives. Britain overreached. The industrial-led narrowed war costs exploded. External competition grew. Financial engineering tried to substitute for structural adaptation. The old prestige remained visible even as the underlying condition weakened. The document frames Bretton Woods as the formal handoff into the dollar age. And that is a fair way to think about it. By the time the ceremony of transfer is held, the economic transfer has often already begun. Fay file cite Fay turn 29 file 0 Fay. That is where people make the first serious mistake in periods like this. They wait for the official declaration. Markets do not reward people for understanding things at the ceremony. Markets reward people who understand them before the ceremony. The United States entered its era of dominance with enormous genuine strengths. Industrial supremacy, military supremacy, an unmatched post-war balance sheet, a dollar tied to gold, then later a petrodollar system that extended the demand for dollars far beyond the natural demand that ordinary trade alone would have created. That is a very powerful combination. It bought the United States decades of latitude that previous powers never enjoyed, and that, ironically, may be part of the problem. When a company has too much pricing power for too long, management often mistakes demand for genius. When a nation has too much monetary privilege for too long, leadership often mistakes external demand for permanence. The source document places a critical turn in 1971, when the gold link was severed. I think any serious student of monetary history has to respect that date. Once a currency is no longer convertible into a constraint outside government discretion, the discipline of the system changes. The question is no longer what the issuer can afford. The question becomes how long confidence will tolerate the gap between what is promised and what is actually anchored. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 29. File 0 Fay confidence can tolerate a lot. That is why long cycles are dangerous. Because the delay between cause and consequence makes the cause look harmless. If you tell a population that it can finance everything, defend everything, insure everything, subsidize everything, and postpone every unpleasant adjustment, because it issues the reserve currency, people will believe it right up until the day the costs start arriving in places they cannot ignore. Some of those costs have already arrived. The document emphasizes the growth in debt, the loss of purchasing power over a century of monetary debasement, and the widening gap between spending and revenue. Whether one quarrels with one figure or another is not the main issue. The main issue is direction. The system has become dependent on expansion, dependent on rollover, dependent on the permanent confidence of creditors, and dependent on the assumption that the measuring stick can keep shrinking without the public eventually noticing what that does to wages, savings, pensions, and long-dated promises. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 29 File 0 Fay once you understand that. The next question is not whether the current order will disappear tomorrow. That is childish. Serious changes are usually slower than alarmists predict and faster than complacent people believe. The real question is whether the incentives holding the system together are getting stronger or weaker. And on that front, I think the source document isolates the most important modern turning point. In 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, Western governments froze roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. Leave aside the moral or strategic argument. I am not discussing that here. I am discussing the incentive effect on every other reserve holder in the world. If assets you thought were your sovereign insurance policy can become inaccessible when geopolitical alignment changes, then reserves cease to be mere reserves. They become conditional reserves. They become political instruments. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 29 File 0. Fay once that line is crossed. Rational actors start asking a new question. Not is the dollar liquid, not is the treasury market deep, but under what conditions do these reserves remain unquestionably mine? That question changes behavior, and behavior, not rhetoric, is what matters. The source document says central bank gold purchases accelerated to the fastest pace since the late 1960s, and it presents that as a measurable vote by official institutions. I think that is the correct lens. When central banks move into physical gold in size, they are not making a fashion statement. They are expressing distrust in the political neutrality of the incumbent reserve system and seeking a reserve asset that cannot be frozen by a rival government. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 29 File 0 Fay Gold has this inconvenient habit of looking old-fashioned right before it starts looking necessary. I am not saying gold is a productive business. It is not. Gold will never invent a better mousetrap. It will never earn a return on equity by delighting customers. It does not compound through reinvestment the way a good operating company does. But that is not its job. Its job in these periods is to sit outside the promises of politicians and outside the liabilities of banking systems. That role becomes more valuable when the system holding everyone together becomes more political, more indebted, and more openly weaponized. The document also points to settlement behavior outside the dollar. Saudi discussion of yuan settlement, BRICS coordination, bilateral trade in local currencies, and broader de-dollarization efforts are all part of the same thing. I would describe it this way. The world does not need a perfect alternative to the dollar in order to reduce its dependence on the dollar. It merely needs enough reasons, repeated often enough, to diversify away from single-point vulnerability. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 29 File 0 Fay, that is a crucial distinction. People love to say, there is no alternative. Usually what they mean is there is no singular, elegant, immediate replacement. That is rarely how transitions occur. The old order is not usually replaced by one clean rival and one clean motion. It is eroded. a little less dollar settlement here, a little more gold there, a little more bilateral trade outside the system, a little more regional finance, a little more reserve diversification, a little less unquestioned faith. At first, these look like exceptions. Later, you realize they were the process. The most expensive sentence in finance is often this one: if the old order is weakening, why does it still look so normal? It looks normal because incumbency decays from the edges inward. A company losing its moat often still reports good numbers for a while. A household living beyond its means may still look affluent for years. A nation in monetary decline may still host deep capital markets, major stock indices, world-class corporations, and broad military power. Those facts do not cancel the process, they simply mask it. That is why I dislike simplistic doom. Doom teaches people to expect a cliff. Real life usually offers a slope. The slope is harder to notice, more dangerous to ignore, and more punishing to the people who respond too late, because they were waiting for a headline that would make the truth emotionally convenient. So what does that slope look like for ordinary savers? It looks like inflation that remains more stubborn than the official comfort story. It looks like savings that earn less than the true rise in living costs. It looks like nominal asset prices that may still rise while real purchasing power quietly falls. It looks like bonds that appear prudent until you realize they are locking you into a return below the rate at which the currency itself is being diluted. It looks like retirement plans that still look respectable on paper while the standard of living they were supposed to secure becomes more expensive each year. The source document describes this as a transfer from soft assets to hard assets, from paper claims to ownership of productive systems and scarce real things. I think that is broadly right, though I would phrase it carefully. In these periods, the assets that tend to defend purchasing power are the ones connected to reality rather than to policy promises: energy, productive land commodities, precious metals, businesses with real pricing power, assets whose value does not depend on a central authority maintaining the purchasing power of the currency used to quote them. Fe Falicite Fe Turn 29 File 0 Fe. That does not mean every oil company is good. Every mine is good, every farm is good, or every commodity bet is wise. It means the category itself matters more when the measuring stick is under pressure. I have always preferred productive assets because, over long periods, they work for you even while you sleep. A farm can produce, a good business can reinvest, a useful piece of infrastructure can serve. A hard asset connected to real human need keeps participating in the economy, regardless of what the central bank says in its next meeting. Cash does not have that quality. Cash gives optionality, and optionality is valuable. But large idle piles of cash in a debasing currency are not safety. They are delayed recognition of loss. Long-duration bonds can be even more deceptive. They offer ritual comfort, they look respectable, they appeal to people who want to feel prudent. But when you lend long to an over-indebted issuer in a currency facing structural dilution, you may simply be volunteering to lose slowly and politely. The source document is especially forceful on that point, and rightly so. It argues that people who believe they are being safe by concentrating in cash and long bonds may actually be standing in the most vulnerable part of the system during a debasement cycle. That is a claim worth taking seriously, because history suggests it has often been true. Fe Falicite Fe Turn 29, File 0 Fe. Now I want to address the three comforting stories that always appear when a dominant order begins to weaken. The first story is exceptionalism. Every aging system tells itself it is exempt from the historical pattern because it is more enlightened, more sophisticated, more inventive, or more necessary than what came before. I have no patience for that way of thinking. A great business is not exempt from bad capital allocation. A great nation is not exempt from arithmetic. The second story is that technology will solve a debt problem. Technology can improve productivity. It can reshape labor markets. It can alter margins, reduce friction, and create enormous fortunes. But technology does not magically erase obligations already issued. A household cannot solve reckless borrowing merely by buying a better calculator. A government cannot solve structural deficits merely by pointing to future innovation. The source document makes this distinction clearly when it rejects the idea that artificial intelligence alone can close a gap created by persistent debt growth and overspending. That is a sober point. Better tools do not repeal balance sheet reality. Faithfulist cite Faturn 29. File 0 Fay. The third story is that because there is no flawless replacement, the incumbent must remain untouched. That is not how trust works. Trust does not disappear all at once. It fragments. A little more trust in gold, a little more trust in local settlement, a little less willingness to hold excess reserves in another country as liabilities, a little more interest in diversification by geography and currency, a little less reverence for the old center. That process can transform the world before the average citizen ever learns the vocabulary to describe it. So, what should a rational person do? I am not going to tell anyone to panic into prophecy, and I am not going to pretend there is one magical asset that solves every problem. The right posture is preparation, not hysteria. If the cycle described in the source document continues, and I believe the directional logic deserves great respect, then a few principles become obvious. You do not want to be dependent on one soft currency for all your optionality. You do not want to confuse nominal stability with real stability. You do not want your future lifestyle tied entirely to the promise that long-dated paper claims will outrun the debasement of the unit they are denominated in. You do want exposure to productive assets, to scarce real assets, and to businesses that can pass through inflation, because customers need what they provide. You do want some thought given to geographic diversification, because a world moving away from pure dollar dependence is a world in which old concentration habits become riskier. And whether or not you like owning gold, you at least need to understand why central banks have been buying it in size. They are not doing that because they are sentimental. They are doing it because they understand that a reserve asset outside the liability structure of any one government becomes more useful as geopolitical and monetary trust deteriorate. Faithfully cite Faturn 29. File 0 Fay. The great mistake is waiting until the transition is obvious. By the time it is obvious, price is usually moved. By the time everybody agrees the ruler is shrinking, the people who own the assets measured by that ruler have already adjusted. That is why the wealthy families who survive major transitions almost never survive by reacting to the last stage. They survive by respecting the early stage. They do not need certainty. They need enough pattern recognition to stop making themselves easy victims. I want to be careful here. I am not arguing that the United States disappears. I am not arguing that the dollar becomes instantly worthless. I am not arguing that great American businesses cease to exist. America still has extraordinary productive capacity, extraordinary entrepreneurial talent, and extraordinary institutional advantages. But none of those strengths give anyone the right to ignore a weakening monetary architecture. A great business can thrive inside a weakening currency. In fact, that is one reason I prefer ownership claims over idle paper. The source document ends with a line of thinking I find useful. It says the coming transfer is not mainly about fear. It is about whether you understand the map before the crowd realizes there was a map at all. That is the essence of it. When a global wealth shift begins, the winning move is not emotional certainty. The winning move is structural clarity. Faithfulist cite Faturn 29 File 0 Fay. Structural clarity lets you see that debt is not just a number. It is future income already spoken for. It lets you see that money printing is not just an abstract policy. It is an invisible transfer from holders of currency to issuers of currency. It lets you see that reserve weaponization is not just geopolitics. It is an advertisement for diversification. It lets you see that central bank gold buying is not nostalgia. It is official behavior in response to an unofficial loss of trust. It lets you see that a long transition is not safety. It is merely more time for the unprepared to keep standing in the wrong place. Whenever people talk about wealth, they tend to talk about getting rich. That is the wrong emphasis in a period like this. The first task is not getting rich. The first task is staying intact while the rules change. Once you stay intact, opportunity appears. It always does. When old claims weaken, new claims are born. When old centers fade, new centers emerge. When paper promises lose authority, real assets regain it. When capital abandons lazy assumptions, disciplined owners acquire things the crowd used to ignore. That is why I do not think about this cycle in terms of apocalypse. I think about it in terms of repricing. What gets repriced: currencies, bonds, hard assets, productive assets, risk itself, time preference, political trust, the future earnings power of nations. All of it gets repriced. And the repricing is rarely fair to people who built their whole lives on the assumption that yesterday's reserve system would protect tomorrow's purchasing power. The people who do best are usually the people who combine two qualities: patience and willingness to offend consensus. Patience keeps them from chasing every dramatic theory. Willingness to offend consensus keeps them from clinging to yesterday's comfort simply because everyone around them is still speaking yesterday's language. If you ask me what the deepest lesson is, it is this: a reserve currency is not immortal. A debt-financed prosperity is not free. A trusted unit of account can keep functioning long after its discipline is gone, but that does not make it healthy. And when the world begins to search for stores of value outside that unit, the search itself becomes part of the transition. That is where I think we are now, not at the end of the process, not at the cinematic climax, but clearly beyond the innocent beginning. The source document is right to say that by the time the music stops, it will be too late to begin thinking seriously. The better time is when the room still sounds orderly. That is when real preparation is possible. Faithful site Fay turn 29, file 0 Fay. If I were speaking to a young saver, I would tell him not to mistake a paycheck for security if every dollar of that paycheck is already committed. If I were speaking to a retiree, I would tell her not to mistake a statement balance for safety if the purchasing power behind it keeps slipping. If I were speaking to an allocator, I would tell him not to measure everything in nominal terms and then congratulate himself for standing still while the ruler shrinks. And if I were speaking to policymakers, I would remind them that confidence is not something you can command forever. It is borrowed from behavior. Once behavior becomes visibly opportunistic, confidence leaves in ways no speech can fully reverse. People like simple predictions. Will the dollar lose reserve status next year? Will gold double in 12 months? Will bonds crash in one clean motion? Those are the wrong questions. The better questions are quieter. Is the world becoming more or less willing to depend on one reserve system? Are official institutions buying assets outside the liability structure of the incumbent order? Are debt dynamics becoming easier or harder to reverse? Are real assets becoming more important in preserving purchasing power? Are savers being trained into concentration habits that belong to a different era? If you answer those honestly, you do not need a dramatic prophecy to improve your position. You need only the discipline to stop pretending that the old arrangement is owed to you. Nothing in markets is owed. Nothing in history is guaranteed. What exists is incentive, structure, arithmetic, and the human tendency to overstay a successful arrangement long after it has begun feeding on itself. I do not know the exact timetable. No honest person does. But I do know that when central banks buy hard assets while the public clings to paper comfort, I pay attention. When debt compounds faster than political courage, I pay attention. When reserve assets become geopolitical weapons, I pay attention. When a population is taught to evaluate wealth in nominal terms while its purchasing power erodes in real terms, I pay attention. That combination is not random. It is the sort of combination history has shown me to respect. In the end, every great wealth transition asks the same question. Will you defend your future with habits built for the old regime, or will you begin building habits suited to the one that is arriving? The answer is rarely found in one trade. It is found in posture, in what you own, in what you refuse to overown, in how you think about cash, in how you think about time, in whether your assets depend on political promise or on human necessity, in whether you are still waiting for the crowd to make the truth emotionally comfortable. I would rather be early in thought than late in comfort. That has served me better than excitement ever did. And in a world where debt keeps rising, where trust is becoming more conditional, where central banks are quietly voting with gold, and where the old monetary privilege is being questioned more openly than most citizens realize, I think that is still the right way to think. The coming years are not mainly going to reward the loudest people. They are going to reward the clearest ones, the people who understand that wealth is not the number on the screen. It is the command you retain over real goods, real time, real opportunity, and real freedom when the unit used to measure all four starts to lose the unquestioned faith it once enjoyed. That is the shift, not a headline, not a slogan, a long transfer of purchasing power, trust and advantage. And once you see it that way, the work becomes very plain. Protect purchasing power, own reality, respect history. Do not lend blind faith to shrinking rulers, and do not wait for the ceremony before admitting the transfer has already begun.